So this is part 3 for the baby elephant blanket tutorial. So in part 2 we came back here to page number 3 and we covered row 1. So at this point we have knit all of our colour A stitches, and for me that's yellow, and we've purled all of the B stitches, and because again it's the double knitting technique, we've brought the yarns to the front to purl and to the back to knit. And at the end of row 1, hopefully what you have is a row that's facing you that is predominantly your colour A. So for me that was yellow, and that is mostly colour A. And what you'll really see is the difference here when I swing over for side on the back. All my B colour stitches, my blue, are really popping there, and you can see if I put it against there for you. So you can really begin to see that what's going to happen is I'm going to have on one side a predominantly yellow background, and on the other side predominantly blue. And what's happened is, as we've worked, because we've carried the yarns all the way through the middle, the yarns have just fallen into the middle each time. And one tip that I always teach when I'm teaching a class on double knitting is to really think of these. Each pair of stitches is like a pair of ballroom dancers. So if one partner does something, then the other partner will echo them. So if I've knit with colour A, I'm going to purl with colour B, and that helps me to keep on track. Another cool tip that I have is that, having established that on row 1 I have my A colour here was my yellow, I'm now going to look to be starting with a yellow stitch on every odd numbered row, and when I turn the work, then I'm looking every time for blue, which happens to be my B colour, and that's another one that I'm going to look out for every even row. So that's another really good tip of how to sort of keep checking yourself, keep yourself right. If it's your first time working double knitting, I personally love lifelines. If you run a lifeline, you only ever have to tink back so far. You don't lose all your work. Some people hate them. It's not something you have to do, but it might be something you want to consider. So, and incidentally, if you are a knitter who prefers to work hand to hand, I typically do, rather than turning your work, you would absolutely be able to work this back now. You would be left-handed knitting back along your row, but for knitters who turn your work, at this point we're going to follow exactly as per pattern. So we're going to go back to our pattern, and row 2 we are now knitting all our colour B stitches, so that's the blue, and purling all of the colour A stitches, so that's the yellow. So again, just as before, we are going to go for a regular knit stitch with the blue, and then we're going to grab both yarns and bring them to the front and purl that first yellow. Now, if you are on YouTube, there are loads of really good resources on there for different edge treatments that you can do, generally with double knitting, that help to keep this side that we're creating nice and tight. But since we're going to fringe this blanket anyway, you can afford to be a little bit more relaxed about that if you want to be. So don't get too het up in that unless, you know, it's a super important piece for a super important baby. Of course, all babies are super important, but if you are, particularly if you're just knitting for enjoyment, don't get too wound up about your edge treatment if this is your first time out, unless you really feel, you know, I'm ready to take that on, in which case all power to your elbow. So again, we are just 2 yarns to the back, knitting all the blue stitches as they meet us, 2 yarns to the front, purling all the yellow stitches, and we're going to continue that all the way down this row and turn, and then we're going to come back up row 3, and row 3 is exactly the same as row 1, so you can go back and review part 2 if you find that you come to row 3 and you're having a panic and you want to work through it again. That would be skipping back to part 2. Otherwise, I will leave you here on row 2, knitting the blue stitches, just like that, yarns in the back, knitting blue, yarns to the front, purling yellow, and I will see you back here to begin working the job.